Our first scripture comes from Micah chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with 10,000 rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sins of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. The word of the Lord.
Our second scripture reading today comes from Matthew 25, verses 34 through 40. This is a very common text. We've probably read this scripture, like 12 times since I've been here. We use this scripture a lot because it's come to define who we are as a church. So please listen to this text, which I hope is becoming very familiar to you. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So I want to welcome you all here today. I want to give you a little bit of background. First of all, I want to introduce to you Dr. Wolfe. Dr. Wolfe, he right now is a visiting professor at Carlton College, and he agreed to come down. I know Kevin from my days at Princeton, and so Kevin, he went to Bowdoin College up in Maine. That's where he got his undergraduate degree in religion. And then he went to the Harvard Divinity School, where he ended up getting his Master's of Theological Studies. We call it, I guess it's an MTS, right? That's what it's called. And then he went to Princeton University, which is where he got his MA and a PhD in religion, where he did a subspecialty in religion, ethics, and politics. It all sounds very complicated, everything that you ended up doing to get there. We met at the gym at Princeton. That's how we got to know each other. So from there, it was probably about, that was like back in 2006, 2000.
About a decade.
It was a while ago. So we've known each other for a while. And the impetus for asking Dr. Wolfe to come here and be present with us this morning came from the fact that over the last year and a half, you may know that there has been quite a lot of media attention paid to the issue in America of race and violence and the various things that are surrounding that. And I have addressed this in brief form in my sermons, but I've been thinking for a while, how can we as a church really talk about this issue? And I have to be very bluntly honest with you, which is that as a white male, I didn't feel that I was quite in the right place to be able to speak about this with the same authority as somebody who's lived it, like Kevin has. And so in talking about this today, the reason why I reached out to Kevin is I said, I want to have a conversation here in this community about this issue, but I want you to be able to help walk us through this as a community which is predominantly white. And so to get us started, I actually want you to tell, if you're willing to, the congregation about where you came from.
Yeah, so I grew up in Trinidad, the larger of the Twin Islands, Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, in a small town called Marabella, which was a pretty poor small town, and the section of the town in which I grew up was the bad section of the poor, bad town. So oftentimes, you would find news reports about crime in Marbella, and they would refer to my area in the newspapers as Helltown. And I moved to Boston in 1993 as a 17-year-old from there.
So what was it like? So when you moved from Trinidad to Boston, what was the culture shift like for you?
Yeah, so in many regards, so especially with regards, let's say, to race, right? In Trinidad, we had already experienced how race works because the makeup is a large number of East Indian descendants and a large number of African descendants. So after the emancipation of the slaves in Trinidad, once blacks got the suffrage, once they got the franchise rather, in order to cut the blacks out of the economy, the English planters brought in large numbers of East Indians as indentured servants, so they could pay them less and cut blacks out of the economy. So we see in Trinidad, at least 25 years ago, the people who have the capital tend to be of East Indian descent, whereas oftentimes the people who had political capital were black, but that means that there were large numbers of poor blacks. And we experienced race very much because of class. So in the US, when I came, it was the same in some ways because we saw, even in Trinidad, we saw through shows like Good Times, the ways in which African Americans express similar sorts of frustrations about lack of social mobility. But what was really different was the feeling of it in the US, the kind of disdain that sometimes I felt.
So was there a point at which, when you came here, that you felt like your race could actually be a liability here in the US?
Yeah. So, and there are two stories that I think exemplify that feeling. So when I first moved, I moved in July to Boston, and went back to high school. But right before school started in September, I had started working in a laundromat, and when school started, I would go after school a couple of nights a week, and then on weekends go work, and I would help the night manager close. And then on the weekends, he'd pay me like $100 cash, and I was saving the money. And then in October, a Friday night I went after school to close the laundromat, and then, left there, let's say 8:15, and this is in Boston. So I went from Boston to Cambridge to go to the mall in Cambridge, and I got there 8:55, so the mall is closing, to buy a winter coat. Didn't get it because the mall was closing, so on the way home, I stopped at a friend's house, and this is around 11-ish. We eat something, watch some wrestling, and I start walking home from his house, and the high school is down here, and the main street home is Westminster Street. So I'm walking up around midnight now, and there's a big park in the middle of Westminster Street, and one street light is out. So I'm walking up the street, and I see a police car drive down, and I keep walking. They get to the end of the street, they just turn around, and they come up behind me slowly. When I get to the dark spot where the one street light is out, they speed up, they come in front of me, and the two officers get out, and one says, "Where are you going?" And I was like, "Officer, I'm just trying to get home right on Wood Ave, which is a few blocks away." And the other says, "Hands up against the car and spread them." I say, "But I didn't do anything." And he unfastens his holster. So I put the hands on the car, I spread them, and they frisk me, and they find the money and take it out of my pocket, and I start to protest. I was like, I worked hard for that. I've been saving it. I wanted to buy a winter coat. And the officer said, "Tell the cops." Took my money. And I'm freezing because it's October and I'm Trini. And then the second story where I realized that, I was just vulnerable, so I did really well in high school. I got into a number of colleges, went to Bowdoin, and, I'm working really hard to show that, look, I can do this. And I walk into class, American politics, and there are about 25 of us, 2 black men, me being one of them. And the professor, says, I don't think black people belong at Bowdoin, and if you all think you all can do well in my class, you have to work harder than your peers to prove to me you belong in my class. And it was the kind of disdain that just my presence was an offense, that I felt that it's a liability. So I've always had to work harder than my peers, I feel, to prove that I belong in places.
Yeah. In the last service, I just wanted to, he said something interesting for the first story. You said you lived your entire life
in Helltown. Yeah.
And you never got robbed once.
Right. So I grew up in Helltown, never been robbed. The one time I got robbed in my life, it was by police in Boston.
So now, as somebody who's white, I might sit here and say, well, that's just your experience. It's an unfortunate experience that you had those things. But how do how does that really apply to everyone across the board? And how would you speak to somebody like me who might sit there and say, well, that's just your experience?
Well, so I'll say a couple of things. One is that, so it is true, right, that I don't think that the majority of police officers are robbing young black men on the streets of night. But I think what we've seen and what we hear, if we have been paying attention, is that a number of stories are coming up about, communities of people who feel their vulnerability with regards to police aggression against them. Again, this is not to say that one group is bad and one group is good, but that if we hear all of these stories, it's not simply just isolated incidents. And if to think through about, well, how do communities that are different feel empathy and are moved to want to do something to help? I would say there are 3 things in terms of why we often have that lack of empathy. One is, right, because of historical circumstances, we tend to live in very segregated neighborhoods, right? If we look at our neighborhood here, it's not very diverse. If we go to the south side of Chicago, for instance, it's not a very diverse community. So we still live very segregated lives. And that separation keeps us, even when we feel for people, we can't truly back up that empathy, in part because we're separate. And sometimes when we hear their stories, we don't experience the world that way, so it's hard to kind of see the veracity of the claims. Another thing is, in part precisely because of the fact that we live these separated lives, when we hear, especially when we come from communities like these, we experience the American dream. So when we hear people from other communities expressing skepticism about the American dream, we shut off because that's not our experiences. So hearing we don't see the reality of the way that their lives are limited. Their ability to experience the American dream is limited. And a third feature that kind of comes into our inability to empathize is, see, I'm forgetting.
Bad sociology.
Bad sociology, thank you. So in the 50s,
and define sociology real quick.
yeah, so it's just the discipline of looking at societies and trying to account for how it's organized the way it's organized. And in the 50s, we had sociologists looking at a number of communities, and oftentimes what the sociologists would try to do when they look at especially poor black communities is try to pin the poverty on their culture. So we get notions like poverty of culture. And it's what a lot of sociologists now are kind of trying to correct is the bad sociology, because what we see is that if we look at poor people all over the world, right? So we look at poor people in Cologne, Germany, for instance, right? Poor white people. Oftentimes you see similar sorts of patterns of behavior, crime, violence, as we see in, let's say, black neighborhoods in Chicago. So the question that whether it's black culture or X person's culture that keeps them poor, the sociologists are saying that's just bad sociology. And those of us who have inherited the kind of bad sociological terms, in part because we're separate and because we experience the American dream differently from other people, we don't see how true sometimes the claim is that it's the other way around, that poverty generates behavioral patterns in part because of lack of access. And sometimes people make poor decisions because of it.
Okay. So it sounds like, we brought up two different issues here. One is, it sounds like we have the issue of the sociology, the issue of culture and race. And then we also have, we also brought up from your example, the issue of policing.
Right.
And so we've heard a lot about the policing issue over the last year and a half, where this has been very, very prevalent. And so I think perhaps maybe the first thing I would say, we do have, I don't know if you all know this, we have a number of police officers and law enforcement officials who are in this congregation. And so one thing I was wondering if you could speak almost directly to them and talking about what do you think that they can do in their practice as, officials who have to guard our safety?
Yeah.
What can they do to reduce or eliminate discriminatory police practices?
Yes, so, right, so we know that we have, bad racial habits in part because of the separation. So that's one thing. But another thing, in terms of just dealing with the number of casualties that we're seeing, I would throw out this big word that we've been hearing, the demilitarization of policing. And it could mean a number of things. What I mean by it is police officers in their training, they do a lot of work on de-escalating situations, but they're also simultaneously trained as if they're soldiers. And oftentimes what happens, especially when race and the sorts of habits we have come to the fore, is our racial habits of, let's say, fearing young black men from Chicago takes over, and the soldier comes out more quickly than the de-escalator. So one of the first things I would say is, if we were to listen to police officers, because we have more and more police officers now standing up and saying, hey, we do have a problem. Black Lives Matter, for instance, isn't just making it up. So even though, we have this big impasse between Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter, the point isn't that Black Lives Matter is right, but if more police officers would listen to their, siblings in blue who are saying, hey, we do have a problem, I think maybe that conversation could get us to start thinking about, well, how do we fix our habits?
Kev brought a clip that we can watch, because when we're talking about the demilitarization of police, I think that can be hard for us to understand. And so when we were having an initial conversation about this, I said, well, what's an example that you could give me of that? And he said, well, the UK is a great example of a police force that is very, very well trained at de-escalation. So we're going to show you a clip here. Let's get the clip up and running. And what this is a clip of a man. He has a machete, and you're going to see him. It's hard to see because this is cell phone footage, but you can see he's surrounded by officers. There he is right there. So you're going to watch as this happens, and Kev, you can take over and talk about this, but they're trying to get him, to basically de-escalate the situation without harming him.
Right. So. And we don't even need to watch the whole clip. Eventually, they get him and confiscate the machete without harming him. And it is true, right, that these officers are in danger, and the issue is never to want to say that people ought to risk their lives willy-nilly, but they're trained at de-escalation, so they're able to, disarm this man. And we've seen many examples, even in Chicago, where, within seconds of showing up on the scene, a guy with a knife, police shoot him. So, again, if we emphasize the de-escalation, demilitarize police with regards to training, I think that we can achieve something, and we have enough sisters and brothers in blue, siblings in blue, actually making the claim for it. So it's not one side is right and the other side is wrong sort of claim.
Yeah. And so I want to reiterate something that Kevin just said up here, which is that, I think in particularly in white culture, when we hear Black Lives Matter, I think that automatically comes off as anti-cop. I've heard that a lot. And I think something that Kevin really brought out for me is that that's not necessarily true, that those two things are not equivalencies to each other, that just because you believe in the Black Lives Matter movement does not mean that you are anti-cop just by saying, yes, I support that. I think that the two definitely work in conjunction with each other. And I think if you've been watching on social media, which I don't know how many of you have this, you see that a lot of police officers are coming out in favor of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, and not necessarily agreeing with everything, but trying to bridge the divide between, let's say, Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter by saying, this is a common issue. We need to fix some of our practices because they reflect larger realities that have to do with how segregated we still live.
Well, let's jump into, because it's perfect for us to jump into so I'm probably, you'd say, right, I'm like the whitest person you probably know.
At least your eyebrows would say it.
So as a church, which if we look around, we are predominantly very white in this church. Not entirely, but predominantly. What can we do here in Arlington Heights to try to, first of all, just be more aware of this issue in our own lives? And what can we do to maybe impact it and change it?
Right. So this is where the religion and ethics and politics part comes out, and hopefully you hear the Christian side of it. So two pillars, right, of Christianity, right, charity and justice. I commend your community for the charitable works that it's been doing, and I'm extremely happy about the mission coming to fruition. Because, through the mission, what you do is you actually impact lives, like you help people from the other side by helping them work themselves out of poverty, and you give them skills and whatnot. But in so doing, you also bring them into this community. You have families meeting them so that when we see their children, we see their children acting badly, we recognize, our children act badly too, and that they're just children rather than, let's say, violent black children, right? So I think that it's wonders to have something like this that brings us together. And then on the justice side, I think that we really need to be careful about the sorts of policies, for instance, that we endorse. So many of us say that, we want to be vigilant against big government and the encroachment of government, and we send politicians to Washington to shrink the government. So that strikes me as bizarre, right? I'm going to send a politician to Washington to shrink. Why don't you just quit? But right, we send them to Washington to shrink government, and oftentimes what the policies they put on the table to cut are the sorts of things that actually help people already in poor neighborhoods. So one example is there was this office, and had maybe 15 people in Trenton who worked there, and what their job is to try to kind of link people up from the community up with jobs. So we know that Trenton is a bit of an opportunity desert in certain areas where, entrepreneurs aren't opening jobs there because aren't opening businesses there because they have no clientele. So in order for people to work, they would go to this office and get linked up with jobs in, let's say, Ewing or Lawrenceville. And before these people could get a paycheck, what the office would do is would provide them money for transportation so that they can get to and from work. And, our current governor in New Jersey, when he came in and he was cutting jobs, shrinking government, what he does is he cuts funds for this program. So not only are people now continue to be unemployed, not only do people continue to be unemployed, you have people who were actually working now unemployed. So cutting government means firing people. And then the little moms and pops shops around where these people would go and buy lunch, for instance, they're experiencing harder times because now nobody could afford it. So it exacerbates the opportunity desert, right? So nobody could actually become an entrepreneur in this area because there's no capital. So if we want to shrink government, right, we have to really be careful about, well, what does that mean? Last word, and I'll be quick, so even the reading in Micah, right, love justice and walk humbly with the Lord, and I made this joke earlier and one person laughed. From 1 Corinthians, not to be confused with 1 Corinthian, 13:13, right? The three values, virtues that will endure, right? Hope, faith, and love. And love is the greatest of these. If we really do want to be the Christians we want to be, and we want to love justice and love people and walk humbly with the Lord, I think we really need to prove that love. How can we say that we love and in our politics and the policies we endorse have it be on the backs of the most vulnerable?
Will you all thank Dr. Wolfe for coming in and being here with us today?
Thanks for having me.
Following the service today, Dr. Wolfe will be back here. I hope that if you have questions for him, that you'll come back and you'll say hello to him, and you can ask him anything that you might want to follow in the service.
And I promise I will get nerdy if we do have conversations about it. That was the unnerdy version.
Thank you all very much.